The crack of gunfire split the dawn air like thunder across the Mojave training grounds, but it wasn't coming from the expected direction. General Marcus Steele lowered his binoculars with a frown, watching smoke rise from targets that should have been impossible to hit from where Sergeant Elena Vasquez knelt in the dust, her weathered Remington 700 pressed against her shoulder like an extension of her soul. "What the hell?" muttered Lieutenant Colonel Brooks, squinting through his own scope at the distant hillside where Elena had positioned herself, a full kilometer beyond the designated firing line. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Nevada desert, and the heat shimmer was already beginning to dance above the sand, making long-distance shooting a fool's errand. Or so they'd thought. Elena didn't move from her prone position, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun that had loosened slightly in the dry wind. Her grandfather's rifle, a Vietnam-era piece that had seen more action than most soldiers twice her age, remained steady in her grip. She'd wrapped the wooden stock with medical tape years ago to cover the scratches and dings, each mark a story her grandfather had told her during long summer evenings on his ranch in New Mexico. The scope wasn't even military grade. It was an old Leupold she'd bought secondhand and calibrated herself, spending countless hours at civilian ranges because the base rarely had time for that old piece of junk, as Sergeant Major Patterson liked to call it. "Vasquez," General Steele's voice carried across the training ground through his megaphone, tinged with irritation and disbelief. "Return to the designated firing position immediately." But Elena was already shifting, her body moving with the fluid precision of someone who had learned to shoot before she could properly hold a pencil. Her breathing slowed to that meditative rhythm her grandfather had taught her. Inhale for 4 counts, hold for 6, exhale for 8. Natural pause, then the gentle squeeze that came not from her finger, but from her entire body working in harmony. The rifle's report echoed again, and another target disintegrated into fragments of wood and metal at an impossible distance. General Steele felt his jaw tighten as he realized what he was witnessing wasn't luck or some kind of elaborate setup. This was skill of a caliber he had rarely seen in his 25 years of military service. Elena's radio crackled to life, Sergeant Major Patterson's gravelly voice cutting through the static. "Vasquez, what's your 20? You're supposed to be at Station 3, not playing mountain goat on that ridge." She keyed the radio without taking her eye from the scope, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Station 12, Sergeant Major, adjusting for wind and elevation." It was a lie. There was no Station 12. She'd positioned herself on an outcropping that gave her a clear line of sight to all 12 targets, each one representing a different challenge. The closest was 1,800 meters, well within normal sniper range. The furthest was just over 2,800 meters, a distance that pushed the boundaries of what her grandfather's old rifle could handle. But as she lined up her 4th shot, Elena wasn't thinking about pushing boundaries or proving points to skeptical generals. She was thinking about her grandfather's weathered hands guiding hers when she was 8 years old, teaching her to read the wind by watching grass bend and dust swirl. She was remembering the weight of his expectations, not for her to be better than the boys, but for her to honor the rifle that had kept him alive through 13 months in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The 4th shot seemed to hang in the air longer than the others, and Elena could almost see its path through the shimmering heat waves. The bullet found its mark with a satisfying clang that echoed off the surrounding hills, and she allowed herself a small smile, not because she was showing off, but because she could feel her grandfather's presence in the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, in the way the rifle fit against her shoulder like it had been made for her. Captain Santos climbed down from the observation tower, her own competitive streak warring with professional admiration. Elena had been quietly outperforming everyone in their unit for months, but she'd always done it from regulation distances with regulation equipment during regulation exercises. This was different. This was Elena stepping out of the shadows where she'd been comfortable and declaring herself a force to be reckoned with. "Sir," Captain Santos approached General Steele, who was still staring at the distant hillside where Elena continued her impossible shooting display. "Sergeant Vasquez has been requesting access to advanced sniper training for over a year. Her scores have consistently been in the top 5%, but she keeps getting passed over for programs that would utilize her skills." General Steele didn't respond immediately, too focused on the 5th shot that had just reduced another target to splinters.
He'd come to Nevada expecting to observe a routine marksmanship competition, maybe identify some promising candidates for specialized training. Instead, he was watching one soldier single-handedly redefine what he thought was possible with outdated equipment and sheer determination. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and creosote across the desert floor, and Elena adjusted accordingly. She'd been raised in country like this, had learned to read the subtle signs that most people missed, the way shadows fell differently when the wind was about to shift, the sound of silence that came just before a gust. Her grandfather had taught her that shooting wasn't just about hitting targets, it was about becoming part of the landscape, understanding the environment so completely that the rifle became just another natural force, like wind or gravity. Shot 6 found its mark, and then 7, each one more impossible than the last. By the time Elena lined up her 8th shot, a small crowd had gathered around General Steele, officers and enlisted personnel alike, drawn by the spectacle of watching precision that bordered on the supernatural. The radio chatter had gone from confusion to amazement to something approaching reverence as reports came in from the target area. "All targets destroyed, sir," came the voice of Staff Sergeant Williams, who had driven out to inspect the damage. "Clean hits, center mass on every one. I've never seen shooting like this at these distances, especially not with—" He paused, apparently looking at the remains of the targets. "Sir, some of these steel plates are completely shattered. Whatever she's shooting, it's hitting with incredible force." Elena didn't hear the radio traffic. She was in that zone her grandfather had described, where time seemed to slow and the world narrowed to just her, the rifle, and the target. The 8th shot was the hardest yet, a small metal disc at 2,650 meters, barely visible even through her scope. But she'd seen her grandfather make shots that seemed impossible, had watched him put bullets through playing cards at distances that made other shooters shake their heads in disbelief. The 9th shot sang through the desert air, and Elena knew it was perfect before it hit. There was a feeling that came with a flawless shot, a certainty that couldn't be explained but was never wrong. The distant clang confirmed what she already knew, and she smoothly worked the bolt to chamber another round.
"Jesus Christ," muttered Lieutenant Colonel Brooks, no longer bothering to hide his amazement. "She's not even using a spotter. How is she compensating for wind drift at those distances?" Private Johnson had given up trying to follow the action through his binoculars and was simply listening to the rhythm of Elena's shooting. Shot 10 came 4 minutes after shot 9, and he realized she was taking her time now, probably adjusting for changing wind conditions as the morning progressed. The desert was notorious for its shifting air currents, thermal updrafts that could push a bullet several feet off target at extreme range. Elena was indeed adjusting, not just for wind, but for the subtle changes in light and temperature that affected her scope's performance. She'd been shooting with this rifle for so long that she knew its quirks better than her own reflection. The way it pulled slightly left when it got hot, the microscopic difference in point of impact between her hand-loaded 175-grain Sierra Match Kings and the military-issue ammunition. The fact that her grandfather had bedded the action himself 40 years ago, creating a level of consistency that mass-produced rifles could rarely match. Shot 11 was the second furthest target, a steel silhouette that wavered like a mirage in the strengthening heat. Elena held her breath, felt her heartbeat slow to that steady rhythm that meant everything was aligned. Body, mind, rifle, and target existing in perfect harmony for the fraction of a second it took the bullet to travel nearly 3 kilometers. The hit was so clean, so perfectly centered, that the steel target rang like a bell. The sound carried across the desert with unusual clarity, and Elena knew that everyone within 5 miles had heard it. She was running out of targets, but more importantly, she was running out of ammunition. Her grandfather's rifle held 5 rounds, and she'd brought only 3 boxes of her carefully prepared handloads. Each cartridge represented hours of precise work, weighing powder charges to the 10th of a grain, seeding bullets to exact specifications, ensuring that every variable she could control was perfect. "Shot 11, she whispered to the rifle, as if it could understand. Target 12 was the furthest, a small metal square at 2,847 meters, according to her range card. At that distance, The bullet would take nearly 4 seconds to reach its target, plenty of time for wind, temperature, and a dozen other factors to push it off course. But Elena had been preparing for this shot her entire life, through countless hours of practice, through her grandfather's stories, through the quiet confidence that came from knowing she belonged here, on this ridge, with this rifle, taking this shot. She exhaled slowly, let her natural point of aim settle, and felt the trigger break with the crispness of a glass rod snapping. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and Elena watched through her scope as the bullet traced its long arc through the desert air. 4 seconds felt like 4 hours, but then the distant target disappeared in a shower of fragments, and the sound of the impact rolled back across the training ground like distant thunder. General Steele slowly lowered his binoculars, his mind struggling to process what he'd just witnessed. 12 targets, 12 hits, distances that pushed the envelope of what was considered possible for military snipers with the most advanced equipment available. And Elena Vasquez had done it with a rifle that belonged in a museum, from a position that wasn't even part of the official course, without a spotter or any of the support equipment that modern precision shooting required. "Sergeant Major." General Steele's voice was carefully controlled, betraying none of the amazement he felt. "I want Sergeant Vasquez in my office at 0800 tomorrow morning." Patterson nodded, but his eyes were still fixed on the distant hillside where Elena was finally rising from her shooting position, her grandfather's rifle cradled in her arms like a sacred artifact. "Yes, sir. Should I tell her what this is about?"
General Steele considered the question as Elena began the long walk back to the base camp, her silhouette wavering in the heat shimmer like something from a legend. He thought about the dozen impossible shots she'd just made, about the quiet confidence that allowed her to position herself outside the official course and rewrite the rules of what was possible. But mostly, he thought about the questions that her demonstration had raised, questions about overlooked talent, about assumptions and traditions, about what his military was missing by not paying attention to soldiers like Elena Vasquez. "No," he finally answered, watching Elena disappear behind a rise. "I think I'll let her wonder about that for a while." Elena Vasquez had learned long ago that reveille at 0530 was both a beginning and an ending, the end of dreams where she could be anyone, and the beginning of another day where she had to prove she belonged. She rolled out of her narrow bunk in the female NCO quarters, her movements automatic after 6 years of military routine, but her mind was still processing yesterday's shooting demonstration and the cryptic message that General Steele wanted to see her this morning. The communal bathroom mirror reflected back a face that had grown harder over the years. Though at 26, Elena still looked younger than most of her peers. Her dark eyes held flecks of gold that became more prominent when she was thinking deeply, and this morning they were practically glowing as she brushed her teeth with mechanical precision while her mind raced through possibilities. The summons could mean recognition, or it could mean discipline for deviating from the prescribed course of fire. In the military, exceptional performance could be either celebrated or punished, depending on whose authority it challenged. "You're up early even for you," observed Master Sergeant Jennifer Chen, emerging from the shower stall with her towel wrapped around her graying hair. At 42, Chen was the senior woman in their unit and had taken Elena under her wing when she'd first arrived at the Nevada base 3 years ago. She had the kind of weathered competence that came from 2 decades of service, including 2 combat deployments in Afghanistan, where she'd served as a convoy gunner. Elena spat out toothpaste and rinsed, meeting Chen's eyes in the mirror. "Couldn't sleep. Keep thinking about yesterday, wondering if I stepped over a line I shouldn't have crossed." Chen studied Elena's reflection, noting the tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there the day before. "You showed them what you're capable of. In my experience, that's either the best decision you'll ever make or the worst mistake. Military doesn't like surprises, even impressive ones."
The weight of that observation settled on Elena as she returned to her bunk area to dress. Her uniform was pressed to perfection, each crease sharp enough to cut paper, but she took extra time with the details this morning. If General Steele was going to dress her down for yesterday's performance, she'd at least look regulation doing it. As she laced her boots, her fingers automatically checked the small photograph tucked inside her left boot. Her grandfather in his dress blues, his sniper badge gleaming on his chest, his eyes holding the same quiet confidence that Elena had felt on that ridge yesterday. Roberto Vasquez had been 17 when he'd lied about his age to join the army in 1967, driven by a combination of patriotism and poverty that left few options for a Mexican-American kid from rural New Mexico. He'd survived 13 months in Vietnam, not through luck, but through an almost supernatural ability to read terrain, weather, and human nature. When Elena was growing up on his small ranch outside Roswell, he'd told her stories not about the men he'd killed, but about the shots he chose not to take, the patience required to wait hours for the perfect opportunity, the weight of responsibility that came with being able to end a life from distances where your target couldn't even see you. "A rifle is just a tool, mija," he'd told her when she was 12, and struggling with the moral implications of hunting. "What matters is the person holding it. A hammer can build a house or break a skull. The hammer doesn't choose, the person does." Elena finished tying her boots and stood, automatically checking her reflection in the small mirror mounted on her wall locker. The face looking back at her was her grandfather's face, softened by her grandmother's features, but unmistakably carrying the Vasquez bloodline. Her grandmother, Maria Elena Santos Vasquez, had been a teacher who'd insisted that education was the path to a better life. She died when Elena was 15, but not before instilling in her granddaughter a love of learning that went beyond what was required in school. The walk to the chow hall took Elena past the armory where her grandfather's rifle was secured, and she felt the familiar pang of separation that came with being away from the weapon that felt more like a part of her body than military-issued equipment. She tried to explain the connection to other soldiers, but most didn't understand the relationship between a shooter and a rifle that had been in the family for decades. Her service weapon, a standard-issue M4 carbine, was reliable and accurate, but it lacked the soul that came with a rifle that had been lovingly maintained through multiple generations. In the chow hall, Elena grabbed her usual breakfast, black coffee, scrambled eggs, wheat toast, and fresh fruit when available, and found herself scanning the room for familiar faces. The morning buzz of conversation seemed different today, with more glances in her direction than usual. Word of yesterday's shooting had apparently spread, which in the military could be either good or bad, depending on who was doing the talking. "Heard you put on quite a show yesterday," said Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, sliding into the seat across from Elena. Rodriguez was one of the few soldiers who'd consistently treated her as an equal rather than a curiosity, probably because his own sister had broken barriers as one of the first female combat engineers in the Marines. "Scuttlebutt says you made some impossible shots with that antique of yours." Elena sipped her coffee, noting that it was slightly bitter today, probably because whoever made it hadn't cleaned the machine properly. "Just did some shooting, nothing special." Rodriguez laughed, a sound that carried genuine amusement rather than mockery. "Right, and I just do some vehicle maintenance when I rebuild an engine from scratch. Elena, half the base is talking about what you did. The other half doesn't believe it actually happened." The conversation died as Sergeant Major Patterson entered the chow hall, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere the way a storm front changes the pressure in a room. Patterson was old-school military, the kind of career soldier who'd enlisted during the Cold War, when the Army was a different institution entirely. He'd served in Panama, the Gulf War, Iraq twice, and Afghanistan 3 times, and he wore his experience like armor that deflected anything softer than absolute professionalism.
Patterson's eyes found Elena immediately, and he approached her table with the measured stride of someone accustomed to having his movements watched and analyzed. "Sergeant Vasquez, report to Building 47 at 0750, General Steele's office." "Yes, Sergeant Major." Elena noted that Patterson's tone was carefully neutral, neither approving nor disapproving, just professionally informative. "And Vasquez." Patterson paused, his weathered face revealing nothing. "Bring your service record." After Patterson left, Rodriguez whistled softly. "Damn, Elena. Service record means this is serious business. Either you're getting promoted or court-martialed. Not much middle ground when generals start asking for paperwork." Elena finished her breakfast mechanically, her appetite gone, but her body needing the fuel. She'd learned early in her military career that emotional reactions were luxuries she couldn't afford, particularly as one of the few women in a combat-related specialty. Every response was scrutinized, every reaction measured against stereotypes about female soldiers being too emotional, too unpredictable, too lacking in the cold calculation that military leadership supposedly required. The truth was more complicated. Elena felt emotions as deeply as anyone, but she'd learned to channel them through the same focusing techniques her grandfather had taught her for shooting. Breathe slowly, assess the situation objectively, make decisions based on facts rather than feelings, then execute with absolute commitment. It was a philosophy that served her well on the firing range and in the complex social dynamics of military life. At 0745, Elena stood outside Building 47 with her service record folder tucked under her left arm, regulation style. The building housed the base's senior leadership, and Elena had only been inside twice before. Once for her initial in-processing 3 years ago, and once to receive a commendation for organizing a charity drive that raised money for wounded veterans. Both experiences had been brief and formal, leaving her with little sense of what awaited her behind General Steele's office door.
The receptionist, a sharp-eyed corporal who looked like she could run the entire base administration single-handedly, directed Elena to a chair outside the general's office. "He's finishing up a call. Should be just a few minutes." Elena sat with perfect posture, her service record balanced on her knees, and tried to calm the nervous energy that was making her leg want to bounce. Through the thin office walls, she could hear the general's voice, though not the specific words. His tone was professional but not harsh, suggesting a routine business call rather than crisis management. The wait gave Elena time to reflect on the path that had brought her to this moment. After her grandfather's death when she was 18, she'd spent 2 directionless years at community college, studying business administration without any real passion for the subject. It was her grandmother's life insurance money that had made college possible, but Elena found herself thinking more about her grandfather's stories than her accounting textbooks. The decision to enlist had come suddenly, triggered by a recruiting station visit that was supposed to be just information gathering. The recruiter, a staff sergeant who'd served in Iraq, had listened to Elena describe her shooting experience and immediately started talking about military occupational specialties that could utilize her skills. Within 6 months, Elena was in basic training at Fort Benning, discovering that the discipline and precision she'd learned on her grandfather's ranch translated perfectly to military life. But the transition hadn't been seamless. Elena's shooting skills were undeniable, but the military had its own way of doing things, its own hierarchy and traditions that didn't always accommodate exceptional individual talent. She learned to work within the system while quietly pushing its boundaries, earning respect through competence rather than confrontation. "Sergeant Vasquez?" The corporal's voice interrupted Elena's reflection. "General Steele will see you now." Elena stood, unconsciously checking that her uniform was perfect, and knocked 3 times on the door of the office, the regulation number for reporting to a superior officer. "Enter," came General Steele's voice from inside. Elena opened the door and stepped into an office that was larger than her entire living space in the NCO quarters. The walls were covered with military awards, unit citations, and photographs that chronicled a distinguished career spanning multiple conflicts and command positions.
Behind a massive oak desk sat General Marcus Steele, a man whose presence seemed to fill the room even when he was sitting still. "Sergeant Vasquez reporting as ordered, sir," Elena said, coming to attention and rendering a crisp salute. General Steele returned the salute and gestured to a chair positioned in front of his desk. "Have a seat, Sergeant. We have some things to discuss." As Elena settled into the chair, she noticed that General Steele's desk held more than the usual administrative materials. Spread across its surface were what appeared to be range cards, ballistic charts, and several photographs that looked like they'd been taken during yesterday's shooting demonstration. The general's expression was unreadable, but his eyes held the sharp focus of someone conducting a serious evaluation. "Yesterday was quite a performance," General Steele began, his voice carrying no indication whether that performance had been good or problematic. 12 targets at distances ranging from 1,800 to nearly 2,900 meters. All hits, all with what I'm told is a 40-year-old hunting rifle that technically shouldn't be capable of that kind of precision at those ranges. Elena remained silent, having learned that when senior officers made statements that sounded like questions, the safest course was to wait for an actual question before responding. General Steele picked up one of the photographs, studying it for a moment before looking back at Elena. "I've been in this business for 25 years, Sergeant. I've worked with some of the finest snipers in our military, soldiers with access to the most advanced equipment and training available. What you did yesterday was remarkable not just for its technical precision, but for the fact that you did it with equipment that most of our specialists would consider obsolete." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving Elena's face. "So my first question is simple. How?" Elena took a breath, organizing her thoughts into the kind of clear, factual response that military leaders expected. "Sir, the rifle was my grandfather's, Staff Sergeant Roberto Vasquez, sniper, Vietnam veteran. He taught me to shoot starting when I was 8 years old. The weapon has been carefully maintained and modified over the years. The ammunition was hand-loaded to precise specifications. The shooting position was selected to minimize environmental factors like wind and temperature variation."
And the distances. Your service record shows qualification scores that are excellent but don't indicate capability at extreme ranges. Sir, most of my long-range shooting experience has been civilian, on my own time and at my own expense. Military ranges and training schedules don't typically accommodate the kind of practice required for extreme distance precision shooting. General Steele nodded slowly, making a note on a pad that Elena couldn't see. "Tell me about your grandfather's influence on your shooting development." For the first time since entering the office, Elena allowed her professional mask to soften slightly. Talking about her grandfather always brought out emotions that she usually kept carefully controlled. "Sir, my grandfather believed that shooting was as much mental as physical. He taught me that equipment is secondary to understanding ballistics, environmental conditions, and most importantly, understanding yourself. He said that a good shooter could make remarkable shots with ordinary equipment, but extraordinary equipment couldn't make an ordinary shooter remarkable." Interesting philosophy. "And you believe that philosophy enabled yesterday's performance?" "Sir, I believe that philosophy enabled me to make the most of the equipment and conditions I had available. The shooting was challenging, but within the theoretical capabilities of the rifle and ammunition, given proper technique and environmental assessment." General Steele set down the photograph and leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense. "Sergeant, I'm going to be direct with you. Yesterday's shooting demonstration has raised questions, not about your capability, which is obviously exceptional, but about how our military identifies and develops talent like yours. Your service record shows that you've been requesting advanced training opportunities for over a year, but those requests have been denied or deferred." Elena felt her pulse quicken, but kept her expression neutral. "Yes, sir. Can you tell me why you think that is?" The question was a minefield. Elena could cite the obvious factors: limited slots, competition from other qualified personnel, budget constraints, but they both knew those were surface explanations. The deeper truth involved assumptions about women in combat roles, institutional resistance to change, and the complex dynamics of a military organization that was still adapting to new realities about gender and capability. Elena chose her words carefully. Sir, I believe there are multiple factors involved in training slot allocation. I may not have effectively communicated my capabilities or potential contribution to advanced programs. It was a diplomatic non-answer, and General Steele recognized it immediately. Sergeant, you just demonstrated capabilities that exceed most of our trained snipers, using equipment that should have made such performance impossible. I don't think communication of your abilities is the issue here. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications that neither could address directly without venturing into territory that was politically sensitive for both of them. Elena understood that General Steele was offering her an opening to be more candid, but she also understood that candidness could be a career-ending mistake. Sir, I believe that my performance yesterday speaks for itself. If there are opportunities for me to contribute more effectively to our mission, I'm prepared to take advantage of them. General Steele smiled, the first break in his professional demeanor since Elena had entered the office. Sergeant, that may be the most diplomatically evasive answer I've heard in years, but I think we understand each other. He stood, moving to the window that overlooked the training grounds where yesterday's demonstration had taken place. I'm going to make you an offer, Sergeant Vasquez. There's a position opening up in a specialized unit that could use someone with your particular skills. The training is intensive, the standards are extremely high, and the work is challenging. But if you're successful, you'd be doing the kind of shooting that would make yesterday look like basic marksmanship. Elena felt her heart rate increase, but kept her voice steady. What kind of position, sir?
The weight of the opportunity settled on Elena like gravity. Everything she'd worked for, everything her grandfather had taught her, had led to this moment. But she also understood the implications of being a trailblazer in an institution that valued tradition and consistency above almost everything else. Sir, may I ask why you're making this offer? General Steele turned from the window to face her directly. Because yesterday you proved that talent doesn't always come in the packages we expect. Because our military is stronger when we utilize all available capabilities. And because I suspect that your grandfather would be proud to see his teachings passed on to a new generation of soldiers. Elena thought about her grandfather's weathered hands guiding hers on that old rifle, about the patience he'd shown teaching a stubborn 8-year-old girl to respect both the weapon and the responsibility that came with exceptional skill. She thought about the photograph in her boot, about promises made to a dying man who'd believed that his granddaughter could be anything she chose to be. Sir, I accept.
Politics of Elena's presence. Welcome to the madhouse, Sergeant. Hope you're ready for some serious shooting. That's the plan, Elena replied, noting that Mendoza's accent carried traces of Texas and that his forearms bore the kind of tan lines that came from spending significant time behind a rifle scope. Kane led Elena through the initial processing, which involved more paperwork than actual orientation. Security clearances had to be verified, medical records reviewed, and equipment assignments completed. The administrative aspects of military life were universally tedious, but Elena appreciated having routine tasks to focus on while she acclimated to her new environment. Your first challenge, Kane explained as they walked toward the armory, is going to be proving that yesterday's shooting wasn't a fluke. The certification process includes a practical demonstration where you'll need to make precision shots at various distances under different conditions. Everyone knows about your performance in Nevada, but this community believes in seeing things firsthand. The armory was a firearms enthusiast's dream, with rack after rack of precision rifles representing the cutting edge of sniper technology. Elena's eyes automatically cataloged the equipment. Custom-built rifles chambered in everything from .308 Winchester to .338 Lapua Magnum,
advanced optics systems that cost more than most people's cars, and support equipment that turned shooting into a highly technical engineering discipline. "Impressive," Elena said, running her fingers along the stock of a rifle that probably represented several months of her salary. "Standard equipment for our graduates, but I understand you prefer to work with your own rifle." Elena smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression she'd felt since arriving. "My grandfather always said that a rifle you trust is worth more than a rifle that's perfect on paper." Kane nodded approvingly. "Smart man. We'll arrange for you to zero your rifle on our range this afternoon. Tomorrow morning, the real work begins." The real work turned out to be an intensive curriculum that pushed every aspect of Elena's shooting knowledge to its limits. The first week covered advanced ballistics theory, environmental factors that affected bullet flight at extreme distances, and the kind of mathematical calculations that turned shooting from art into science. Elena found herself in classrooms with whiteboards covered in equations for calculating bullet drop, wind drift, and atmospheric pressure effects that could mean the difference between a hit and a miss at distances exceeding 2 kilometers. Staff Sergeant Brennan taught the ballistics course with the intensity of someone who'd learned these principles through life-and-death experience rather than textbooks. At 1,500 meters, Brennan explained during a particularly complex lesson on wind reading, a 5-mile-per-hour crosswind will push a .308 bullet approximately 18 inches off target. But wind isn't constant or uniform. You might have 5 miles per hour at your position, 10 miles per hour halfway to the target, and 3 miles per hour at the target. Learning to read and compensate for variable wind conditions separates competent snipers from exceptional ones. Elena absorbed the technical information eagerly, but she noticed that several of the other instructor candidates seemed to resent her presence in what they considered their exclusive domain. During break periods, conversations would stop when she approached, and study groups would mysteriously disband when she tried to join them. The tension came to a head during the second week in a practical exercise that required teams of 2 to engage targets at various distances while being timed and scored on accuracy. Elena had been paired with Sergeant First Class Williams, who had made his skepticism about her presence clear through a series of subtle slights and professional discourtesies.
"Look," Williams said as they prepared for their first engagement, "I know you made some lucky shots in Nevada, but this is different. This is about consistent performance under pressure, not one-time demonstrations for impressed generals." Elena felt her temper flare, but kept her voice level. "I understand the requirements, Sergeant. I'm here to meet them." "We'll see," Williams muttered, settling into his position as spotter, while Elena prepared to engage the first target, a steel plate at 800 meters that required precise placement to score maximum points. The shot was routine for Elena, well within the comfort zone she'd established through years of practice, but as she settled behind her grandfather's rifle, she felt the weight of expectation from the instructors observing the exercise and the skepticism radiating from Williams beside her. The familiar process of breathing control and trigger management felt different under such intense scrutiny. The shot broke cleanly, and the distant target rang with the satisfying sound of a center hit. Elena worked the bolt smoothly and prepared for the second engagement without comment or celebration. "Lucky shot," Williams said quietly, just loud enough for Elena to hear, but not loud enough for the observing instructors to detect. The second target was at 1,200 meters, and the third at 1,600 meters. Elena hit both with the same steady precision, but Williams continued his quiet commentary, designed to undermine her confidence. By the fourth target, a challenging shot at 1,900 meters in variable wind conditions, Elena was fighting not just environmental factors, but the psychological pressure of constant disparagement. The shot felt wrong the moment it left the barrel, and Elena knew she'd pulled it slightly to the right. The miss was minor, perhaps 6 inches from the center of the target, but in the context of a scored exercise, any miss was significant. "There it is," Williams said with satisfaction. "Pressure gets to everyone eventually." Elena felt something cold and hard settle in her chest, a combination of anger and determination that reminded her of her grandfather's stories about moments when everything hung in the balance. She chambered another round and settled back into position, but this time she wasn't shooting for scores or certification requirements. This time she was shooting to prove that Williams and everyone else who doubted her were wrong. The fifth target was at the maximum range for the exercise, 2,100 meters in gusty wind conditions that made accurate shooting extremely difficult. Elena took her time, reading the wind indicators positioned along the range, calculating corrections based on everything she'd learned in the past 2 weeks and everything her grandfather had taught her over the years. The shot was perfect, not just a hit, but a shot that found the exact center of the target with such precision that the impact point was clearly visible even at extreme distance. The observing instructors exchanged glances, and Williams fell silent for the first time since the exercise had begun. "Outstanding shooting, Sergeant Vasquez," called Master Sergeant Kane from the observation tower. "That's the kind of precision we expect from our instructors." But Elena's satisfaction was short-lived. As they packed up their equipment, Williams made his final assessment clear. "Good shooting today, but one range session doesn't make you instructor material. This program isn't just about hitting targets, it's about teaching other soldiers to hit targets, and that requires credibility that goes beyond a few lucky shots." That evening, Elena sat alone in her temporary quarters, cleaning her grandfather's rifle with the methodical care he had taught her. The familiar routine of disassembly, cleaning, and reassembly was meditative, allowing her mind to process the day's events and plan for the challenges ahead. A knock at her door interrupted the process, and Elena opened it to find Staff Sergeant Mendoza holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might want some company," he said, offering her one of the cups. They sat in Elena's small living area, the rifle spread across the towel on her coffee table between them. Mendoza examined the weapon with an appreciative eye of someone who understood craftsmanship. "This is the rifle from the Nevada demonstration?" he asked, noting the worn but well-maintained wood stock and the carefully mounted scope. "Vietnam era. My grandfather carried it through 13 months in country, then used it for hunting and competitive shooting for the next 40 years. Mendoza nodded approvingly. "I can see why you trust it. There's something to be said for a rifle that's proven itself over time." He paused, sipping his coffee. "There's also something to be said for a shooter who can make that kind of weapon perform at modern standards."
Some of the other instructors don't seem to see it that way. "Some of the other instructors are idiots," Mendoza said bluntly. "Williams in particular has issues with authority that don't fit traditional patterns. He's a good soldier and an excellent shot, but he's also insecure about his position in the pecking order." Elena looked up from the rifle component she'd been cleaning. "And my presence threatens that position?" "Your presence threatens everyone's assumptions about what an elite shooter looks like. Most of these guys have built their identities around being part of an exclusive club. Having a woman not just join the club but potentially outperform them challenges everything they believe about themselves." The conversation was interrupted by another knock, this one more aggressive than Mendoza's polite tap. Elena opened the door to find Staff Sergeant Brennan standing in the hallway, his expression tense with barely controlled anger. "We need to talk," Brennan said without preamble. Mendoza stood to leave, but Brennan held up a hand. "Actually, Carlos, you should probably hear this too." Brennan entered the room and immediately saw the disassembled rifle on the coffee table. His expression softened slightly as he recognized the craftsmanship and care that had gone into maintaining the weapon. "Look, Vasquez," Brennan began, his voice carrying a weariness that suggested this conversation was as difficult for him as it would be for Elena. "I'm going to be straight with you because you deserve that much. There are people in this program, instructors and students, who don't want you here. They think this whole thing is some kind of social experiment that's going to lower standards and compromise the integrity of what we do." Elena felt her jaw tighten but said nothing, waiting for Brennan to continue. "The problem is that you're making it hard for them to justify that position.
Your shooting is exceptional, your technical knowledge is solid, and your work ethic is obvious to anyone paying attention. So they're looking for other ways to discredit you." "What kind of ways?" Mendoza asked, his voice carrying an edge that suggested he had his own suspicions. Brennan hesitated before answering. "There's talk about your weapon not meeting program standards, about your training methods being unorthodox, about whether someone who learned to shoot from a civilian can really understand military applications." Elena set down the rifle component she'd been holding, her hand steady despite the anger building in her chest. "And what do you think, Staff Sergeant?" "I think," Brennan said slowly, "that anyone who can consistently put rounds on target at the distances you've demonstrated understands something fundamental about shooting that can't be taught in a classroom. I also think that some of the best soldiers I've served with learned their skills in ways that didn't fit traditional military molds." He paused, studying Elena's face in the dim light of her quarters. "But I also think you need to understand what you're up against. This isn't just about proving you can shoot. This is about proving you belong in a community that spent decades defining itself by who it excludes." The weight of that statement settled over the room like smoke, heavy and inescapable. Elena had understood intellectually that being the first woman in the program would bring challenges, but she was beginning to appreciate the depth of resistance she faced. "So what do you recommend?" Elena asked. "Be perfect," he said simply. "Don't give them any excuse to question your competence, your commitment, or your understanding of what this job requires. And be prepared for the fact that even perfect might not be enough for some people." After Brennan and Mendoza left, Elena continued cleaning her rifle in the silence of her quarters. Each component was inspected, cleaned, and carefully reassembled, the familiar routine helping her process the conversation and its implications. Her grandfather had faced similar challenges as a young Mexican-American soldier in an army that wasn't always welcoming to ethnic minorities. He'd succeeded through a combination of exceptional performance and patient persistence, proving his worth one shot at a time. As Elena finished reassembling the rifle, she thought about the photograph in her boot and the promises she'd made to herself and to her grandfather's memory. The path ahead was becoming clearer, even if it was more difficult than she'd anticipated. She would have to be more than good. She would have to be undeniably exceptional, not just as a shooter, but as a teacher, a soldier, and a representative of possibilities that others couldn't yet imagine. The next morning brought news that would test Elena's resolve in ways she couldn't have anticipated. Master Sergeant Kane called her into his office before the day's training began, his expression more serious than usual. "We've received a formal complaint about your participation in the program, specifically concerns about whether your weapon meets program standards and whether your training background is sufficient for instructor certification." Elena felt her stomach drop, but kept her expression neutral. "What kind of concerns, Master Sergeant?" Kane consulted a document on his desk, his jaw tight with what appeared to be professional frustration. "The complaint alleges that your rifle is not military specification equipment and therefore gives you an unfair advantage in demonstrations. It also questions whether civilian shooting experience can translate to military applications without formal military sniper training." "Who filed the complaint?" "That information is confidential, but I think you can guess." Kane set down the document and looked directly at Elena. "Here's the situation. The complaint has been forwarded to the program director, and there's going to be a formal review of your status in the program." Elena felt the walls of possibility closing around her, but she forced herself to think tactically rather than emotionally. "What does the review process involve?" "You will have to demonstrate your capabilities using standard military equipment rather than your personal weapon. You'll also undergo additional evaluation of your teaching methods and technical knowledge." Kane's expression softened slightly. "Elena, I want you to know that this complaint doesn't reflect the opinion of everyone in the program, but it does represent a significant challenge that you're going to have to overcome." The formal review was scheduled for the following week, giving Elena time to prepare, but also to worry about the implications of failure. If you couldn't demonstrate the same level of performance with military standard equipment, it would validate the concerns about her unconventional background. If she failed the teaching evaluations, it would confirm suspicions about her ability to translate personal skill into instructional capability. Elena spent the intervening days in intensive preparation, familiarizing herself with every rifle in the armory and adapting her shooting techniques to different weapon systems. The military standard sniper rifle was a precision instrument, but it lacked the personal connection and familiarity that made her grandfather's rifle feel like an extension of her body. Staff Sergeant Mendoza proved to be an invaluable ally during this period, helping Elena understand the subtle differences between various rifle systems and offering insights into the teaching methods that the program valued. The key, he explained during one late-night practice session, is showing that you can adapt your knowledge to different students and different situations. They need to see that you're not just a gifted individual shooter, but someone who can help others achieve their potential. Elena took her time with each shot, applying the same methodical approach her grandfather had taught her, but adapting it to the different characteristics of the military rifle. The weapon's trigger was different from her grandfather's rifle, requiring slightly more pressure and having a different breakpoint. The scope was more advanced, but also more complex, with additional features that Elena had to consciously ignore to focus on the fundamental task of putting bullets on target.
What specific aspect of long-range shooting would you like to focus on? Elena asked, maintaining professional courtesy despite their previous interactions. Wind reading, Williams replied. I've been having trouble with consistency at distances beyond 1,500 meters. Elena nodded, recognizing both the legitimacy of the challenge and the opportunity it represented. Wind reading was one of the most difficult aspects of long-range shooting to teach because it required combining technical knowledge with intuitive understanding that came only through extensive experience. Let's start with the technical foundation, Elena began, positioning herself beside Williams as he settled behind the rifle. Wind reading isn't just about estimating speed and direction at your position. You need to read the wind along the entire bullet path, understanding that conditions can change significantly between you and the target. She guided Williams through the process of using wind indicators, flags, vegetation movement, mirage effects, to build a complete picture of atmospheric conditions. Elena's explanations were clear and systematic, breaking down complex concepts into manageable components while demonstrating practical application techniques. The key, Elena explained as Williams prepared for his shot, is developing confidence in your reading. Doubt creates hesitation, and hesitation destroys timing. Trust your assessment, make your correction, and execute the shot with commitment. Williams took the shot, and Elena could tell immediately that it was well placed. The target rang with a solid hit, and Williams turned to her with an expression of genuine surprise. That was the most consistent wind call I've made at this distance, he admitted, his professional honesty overriding his personal skepticism. Elena worked with the other volunteer students with similar success, demonstrating teaching techniques that combined technical precision with practical application. Her explanations were clear without being condescending, detailed without being overwhelming, and always focused on helping each student understand concepts in ways that matched their individual learning styles. When the formal evaluation concluded, Elena felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She'd performed well, but the ultimate decision rested with the evaluation panel and their interpretation of what they'd observed. Colonel Harrison dismissed the group without indicating how the review had been received, leaving Elena to wait for an official decision that could determine the course of her military career. As she secured the weapons she'd used and gathered her equipment, Elena reflected on the irony that her future now depended on the judgment of people who initially doubted her presence in their exclusive community. That evening, Elena sat in her quarters with her grandfather's rifle across her lap, not cleaning or maintaining it, but simply holding the weapon that represented so much of her identity and aspirations.
The knockouter bore came earlier than expected, just after 1900 hours. Elena opened it to find Master Sergeant Kane standing in the hallway, his expression unreadable in the dim corridor lighting. "Sergeant Vasquez," Kane said formally. "Colonel Harrison wants to see you in his office at 2000 hours." Elena felt her heart rate increase, but kept her voice steady. "Yes, Master Sergeant." Kane hesitated for a moment, then added in a less formal tone, "Elena, regardless of what happens tonight, you've earned respect here. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The walk to Colonel Harrison's office felt longer than usual, and Elena found herself thinking about alternative career paths if the evaluation hadn't gone well. She could return to her previous unit, continue serving as a regular soldier, perhaps eventually find other opportunities to use her shooting skills. But the prospect of leaving this program felt like abandoning not just her own dreams, but her grandfather's legacy. Colonel Harrison's office was larger than the other administrative spaces Elena had seen, with walls covered in military memorabilia that spoke of a distinguished career spanning multiple decades and conflict. Behind his desk, Colonel Harrison sat with Elena's evaluation folder open before him, his expression revealing nothing about its contents.
"Have a seat, Sergeant," Harrison said, gesturing to a chair positioned in front of his desk. Elena sat at attention, her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes focused on a point just above Harrison's head, the military posture for receiving important information from a superior officer. "Sergeant Vasquez," Harrison began, his voice carrying the formal tone of official pronouncement. "The evaluation panel has completed its review of your performance and capabilities." Elena held her breath, waiting for the decision that would shape her future. "The evaluation panel," Colonel Harrison continued, his weathered face maintaining its professional mask, "has determined that your performance exceeds program standards in all measured categories." He paused, allowing the weight of those words to settle before continuing. "However, the complaint against your participation has raised questions that extend beyond individual performance metrics." Elena felt a complex mixture of relief and apprehension. Her shooting and teaching had been validated, but the qualification in Harrison's voice suggested that bureaucratic complications remained. "Sir, may I ask what specific questions remain to be addressed?" Harrison leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since Elena had entered his office, his expression softened slightly. "Sergeant, in my 28 years of military service, I've learned that exceptional performance sometimes creates as many problems as it solves. Your demonstration yesterday was remarkable, not just the shooting, but the teaching. You helped Williams make shots he'd been struggling with for months, and you did it in 30 minutes using techniques that our standard curriculum doesn't adequately address." Elena waited, understanding that Harrison was building towards something significant. "The problem," Harrison continued, "is that your success highlights deficiencies in our current approach. Your grandfather's training methods, your civilian shooting experience, your unconventional equipment choices, they've produced capabilities that our formal military training hasn't matched. That makes some people uncomfortable." "Including the person who filed the complaint?" Harrison smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Elena had seen from him. "Sergeant Williams came to see me this morning. Seems yesterday's instruction session had quite an impact on him. He wanted to withdraw his complaint and apologize for filing it in the first place." Elena felt her eyes widen, despite her efforts to maintain professional composure. "Williams filed the complaint." "He did, and, to his credit, he also had the integrity to admit when he was wrong." Harrison opened Elena's file and consulted a handwritten note. His exact words were, "I let my personal insecurities interfere with my professional judgment. Sergeant Vasquez is exactly the kind of instructor this program needs." The revelation reframed everything Elena had experienced over the past few weeks. Williams's hostility hadn't been simple prejudice, but rather defensive reaction of someone who felt threatened by capabilities he didn't understand. His withdrawal of the complaint represented not just a change of heart, but a fundamental shift in how he perceived Elena's presence in the program. However, Williams's change of heart doesn't resolve the larger questions your performance has raised.
We need to understand how someone with your background achieved capabilities that exceed those of soldiers with formal military sniper training. More importantly, we need to understand how to incorporate your methods into our curriculum. Elena realized that she was no longer being evaluated for acceptance into the program, but rather being positioned as someone who could help reshape it. The recognition was gratifying, but it also carried implications that extended far beyond her personal career goals. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand what you're asking." Harrison stood and moved to the window overlooking the training complex, his hands clasped behind his back in the contemplative posture of a senior officer processing complex decisions. "I'm asking you to help us understand what we've been missing. Your grandfather's training methods produced results that our formal curriculum hasn't matched. Your approach to equipment selection, your techniques for reading environmental conditions, your methods for teaching complex concepts, they represent knowledge that could benefit every soldier in this program."
The scope of the opportunity was staggering. Elena had entered the program hoping to become an instructor. Now she was being asked to help redesign the instruction itself. "What would that involve?" Elena asked. "We want you to document your training methods, work with our curriculum development team to integrate unconventional techniques into our standard approach, and serve as a mentor for other instructors who want to expand their capabilities." Harrison turned from the window to face Elena directly. It would mean staying at Fort Bragg longer than originally planned, working with civilian contractors and military education specialists, and essentially becoming the subject matter expert on non-traditional marksmanship training. Elena thought about her grandfather's patient teaching, the countless hours he'd spent not just showing her how to shoot, but explaining why certain techniques worked and others didn't. His knowledge had been developed through decades of experience, refined through constant practice, and transmitted through oral tradition rather than formal documentation. "Sir, much of what my grandfather taught me was intuitive rather than systematic. I'm not sure how well it would translate to formal curriculum." "That's exactly why we need your help," Harrison replied. "Military training is excellent at teaching systematic approaches to complex problems, but sometimes the most important knowledge exists in the spaces between systems, in the intuitive understanding that experienced practitioners develop over time. Your job would be to bridge that gap." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at Harrison's door. "Enter," he called, and Elena turned to see Master Sergeant Kane stepping into the office. "Sir," Kane said, "I apologize for the interruption, but we've received some news that Sergeant Vasquez should hear." Harrison nodded, and Kane approached Elena with an expression that mixed professional formality with barely contained excitement. "Elena, we just got word from the Pentagon. Your performance in Nevada, combined with yesterday's evaluation, has attracted attention at very high levels. There's been a request for you to participate in a special demonstration for senior military leadership." Elena felt the ground shifting beneath her feet once again. "What kind of demonstration?" Kane consulted a message form he'd been carrying. "Multi-service marksmanship exhibition at the Army Sniper School. Participants will include representatives from all branches of the military plus selected allied forces. The purpose is to showcase advanced capabilities and explore new training methodologies." Harrison's expression suggested that he'd been expecting this development. "Sergeant, this is an opportunity to influence military marksmanship training on a scale that extends far beyond our program here. It's also a level of visibility that will put you at the center of debates about women in combat roles, training standards, and equipment policies." Elena realized that her personal journey was becoming entangled with larger institutional questions about change, tradition, and the military's adaptation to new realities. Her success was creating opportunities, but it was also creating responsibilities that extended beyond her individual career goals. "When is this demonstration?"
Elena asked. 3 weeks, which gives us time to prepare, but not much time to develop new curriculum components that you could showcase. Harrison moved back to his desk and picked up Elena's file. Sergeant, I'm going to be direct with you. This demonstration represents a fork in the road for your career and for our understanding of marksmanship training. If you perform well, it could open doors that didn't exist before. If you don't perform well, it could close doors that are currently open. Elena thought about her grandfather's stories of moments when everything hung in the balance, when years of preparation came down to a single shot or a single decision. He'd taught her that such moments weren't accidents, but rather the natural result of consistent effort and principled choices.
Sir, I accept the assignment. Over the next 3 weeks, Elena found herself at the center of an intensive preparation effort that involved not just her own training, but the development of demonstration materials that could showcase unconventional marksmanship techniques. She worked with curriculum developers to document her grandfather's teaching methods, with equipment specialists to explain her approach to rifle selection and modification, and with instructional designers to create presentations that could communicate complex concepts to diverse audiences. The most challenging aspect was translating intuitive knowledge into systematic instruction. Elena's grandfather had taught her to read wind through observation and feel rather than through mathematical calculations. He'd shown her how to assess rifle performance through subtle changes in recoil and sound rather than through purely mechanical measurements. Capturing such knowledge in formal documentation required Elena to analyze her own shooting process with a level of detail she'd never attempted. "This is harder than I expected," Elena admitted to Staff Sergeant Mendoza during one of their late-night preparation sessions. They were working in the classroom, surrounded by whiteboards covered with diagrams and notes as they tried to systematize techniques that Elena had learned through years of practice. "You're trying to explain magic," Mendoza replied, studying a wind-reading chart they'd been developing. "Your grandfather spent 40 years learning to read environmental conditions through observation and experience. Now you're trying to teach that same capability to people who've never spent time learning to see the way he taught you to see." Elena nodded, recognizing the fundamental challenge. Military training excelled at teaching reproducible procedures, but the most valuable marksmanship skills often depended on developing intuitive capabilities that couldn't be reduced to step-by-step instructions. "Maybe that's the wrong approach," Elena said, staring at the complex diagrams they'd been creating. "Maybe instead of trying to systematize the intuitive aspects, we should focus on teaching people how to develop their own intuitive capabilities." Mendoza looked up from the chart he'd been studying. "What do you mean?" "My grandfather didn't teach me specific wind reading techniques as much as he taught me how to observe, how to notice patterns, how to trust my own assessment of conditions. Maybe the curriculum should focus on developing observational skills rather than memorizing correction formulas." It was a subtle but significant shift in approach, and as Elena and Mendoza worked to implement it, they found that their demonstration materials became more focused on principles and practice rather than procedures and calculations. The multi-service demonstration was held at Fort Benning, Georgia, home of the Army Sniper School and one of the military's premier marksmanship training facilities. Elena arrived to find a gathering that represented the highest levels of military marksmanship expertise. Instructors from all branches of service, representatives from allied militaries, and senior officers whose decisions would shape training policies for years to come. The demonstration format involved both individual shooting exhibitions and instructional presentations, allowing participants to showcase both their personal capabilities and their approaches to teaching others. Elena was scheduled to present on non-traditional marksmanship training methods and to demonstrate long-range precision shooting using her grandfather's rifle. The night before her presentation, Elena sat in her temporary quarters cleaning her grandfather's rifle with the same methodical care he'd taught her decades earlier. The familiar routine helped calm her nerves and reminded her of the principles that had guided her to this moment: respect for the weapon, patience with the process, and commitment to continuous improvement. A knock at her door interrupted her preparation, and Elena opened it to find General Steele, the officer who had first offered her the opportunity that led to this moment. His presence at Fort Benning surprised her, but his warm smile immediately put her at ease. "Sergeant Vasquez," General Steele said, accepting her invitation to enter, "I wanted to see how you were feeling about tomorrow's demonstration." "Nervous but prepared, sir. This is a much larger audience than I expected when I first agreed to pursue instructor training." General Steele noticed the rifle spread across Elena's coffee table and examined it with obvious appreciation. "Your grandfather's weapon?" "Yes, sir. Vietnam era, but carefully maintained and modified over the years." "I'd like to hear more about your grandfather's influence on your shooting development. From what I understand, his training methods are at the heart of tomorrow's presentation." Elena found herself telling General Steele about her grandfather's patient teaching, his emphasis on observation and intuition, his belief that exceptional shooting came from understanding rather than just technique. As she talked, she realized how much her grandfather's influence extended beyond marksmanship to her approach to learning, problem-solving, and professional development. "He sounds like the kind of soldier who understood that real expertise comes from integration of knowledge, experience, and judgment," General Steele observed. "Those are the qualities we need more of in our military education programs." "Sir, may I ask why you took an interest in my career? There must be many soldiers with exceptional shooting skills who don't receive the same opportunities I've been given." General Steele considered the question seriously before answering. "Sergeant, the military is facing challenges that require us to reconsider how we identify, develop, and utilize talent. Your performance in Nevada demonstrated capabilities that our formal training programs hadn't produced. That suggests we're missing something important in our approach to developing expertise." He paused, studying the partially assembled rifle on the table. "More broadly, we're learning that diversity of background and experience often produces better results than homogeneous training and thinking. Your grandfather's unconventional methods, your civilian shooting experience, even your perspective as a woman in a male-dominated field, they all contribute to capabilities that our traditional approach doesn't develop." The conversation continued for another hour, covering topics that ranged from Elena's immediate career goals to broader questions about military education and training philosophy. When General Steele left, Elena felt not just prepared for tomorrow's demonstration, but also more clearly aware of her role in larger institutional changes. The demonstration began with individual shooting exhibitions, allowing each participant to showcase their personal capabilities under controlled conditions. Elena was scheduled to shoot last, which meant spending the morning watching other highly skilled marksmen demonstrate their abilities with various weapon systems and techniques. The standard of shooting was exceptional. Soldiers representing different branches and specialties engaged targets at distances ranging from 600 to 1,800 meters, with precision that reminded Elena why she felt honored to be included in such company. Navy SEALs, Marine Scout snipers, Army Rangers, Air Force pararescue, each demonstrated techniques refined through years of training and real-world application. But as Elena watched the demonstrations, she noticed that most participants were using similar equipment and following comparable procedures. The shooting was excellent, but it was also remarkably uniform in approach. When her turn came, Elena realized that her grandfather's rifle and unconventional methods would stand out dramatically from what had preceded her. Sergeant Elena Vasquez, representing the Army Sniper School Instructor Program, announced the range officer as Elena approached the firing line with her grandfather's rifle. The assembled observers, more than 50 senior military personnel, fell silent as Elena settled into her shooting position. The targets for her demonstration had been positioned at distances ranging from 1,200 to 2,400 meters, challenging ranges that would test both her personal capabilities and her equipment's performance. Elena began with her standard preparation routine, taking time to assess wind conditions through observation rather than relying solely on the electronic wind meters that other participants had used. She studied grass movement, flag positions, and mirage effects with the patient attention her grandfather had taught her, building a complete picture of atmospheric conditions along the bullet's path. The first shot was at 1,200 meters, well within her comfort zone, but serving as a warm-up for the longer distance challenges to follow. Elena settled behind her rifle, applied her breathing control techniques, and felt the familiar sensation of everything aligning: body, mind, weapon, and target existing in perfect harmony for the fraction of a second required for the shot.
The rifle's report echoed across the range, and the distant target rang with the unmistakable sound of a precise hit. Elena worked the bolt smoothly and prepared for the second engagement without celebration or acknowledgement, maintaining the focused concentration that extreme distance shooting required. The second target was at 1,600 meters, and the third at 2,000 meters. Both fell to center hits that demonstrated not just Elena's shooting capability, but her rifle's remarkable accuracy despite its age. The observing officers exchanged glances and quiet comments as they realized they were witnessing something unusual. But it was the fourth shot that truly captured everyone's attention. The target was positioned at 2,400 meters, near the theoretical limit of a rifle's effective range, and well beyond the distances that most of the other participants had attempted. Elena took nearly 10 minutes to prepare, reading and rereading wind conditions as they shifted in the afternoon heat. When she finally squeezed the trigger, the shot felt perfect from the moment it left the barrel. 4 seconds later, the distant target disintegrated in the shower of fragments that was visible even at extreme range. The sound of the impact rolled back across the demonstration area like distant thunder, and the silence that followed was filled with professional amazement. "Outstanding marksmanship," announced the range officer, but his words seemed inadequate to describe what everyone had witnessed. Elena stood and shouldered her rifle, feeling the same quiet satisfaction that came with any well-executed shot. But as she walked back toward the observation area, she could sense that the demonstration had accomplished something beyond showcasing individual capability. It had raised questions about assumptions and possibilities that the assembled officers would be processing long after the event concluded. The instructional presentation phase of the demonstration allowed Elena to explain the philosophy and methods behind her shooting performance. Standing before an audience of senior military instructors, she felt the weight of representing not just her own capabilities, but her grandfather's legacy and the potential for expanding how the military approached marksmanship training. Traditional military marksmanship training emphasizes systematic procedures and standardized equipment, Elena began, her voice carrying clearly through the demonstration hall. These approaches are effective and have produced generations of competent marksmen, but they may not fully utilize the potential that exists when we combine systematic training with intuitive skill development. She clicked to her first slide, which showed a photograph of her grandfather in his Vietnam-era uniform, his sniper badge prominently displayed. "My grandfather, Staff Sergeant Roberto Vasquez, learned to shoot during an era when equipment was simpler, but expectations were just as high. His training methods emphasized developing observational skills, building intuitive understanding of environmental factors, and creating a personal relationship with his weapon that went beyond technical specifications." Elena spent the next 30 minutes walking the audience through specific techniques that her grandfather had taught her, demonstrating how observation-based wind reading could supplement mathematical calculations, how weapon familiarity could enhance performance even with older equipment, and how patience and persistence could develop capabilities that formal training alone might not achieve. The goal, Elena concluded, isn't to replace systematic training with intuitive methods, but to integrate both approaches in ways that produce capabilities neither could achieve alone. Modern equipment and advanced techniques can provide the foundation, while traditional methods and patient practice can unlock potential that textbooks and procedures alone cannot access. The question and answer session that followed revealed both enthusiasm and skepticism from the audience. Several officers wanted specific details about implementing Elena's methods in their training programs, while others questioned whether unconventional approaches could be standardized enough for military-wide application.
"Sergeant," asked a Marine colonel whose chest bore the ribbons of multiple combat deployments, "how do we teach intuitive skills to soldiers who don't have access to the kind of mentorship you received from your grandfather?" Elena had anticipated this question and had spent considerable time developing her response. "Sir, I believe the key is creating training environments that emphasize observation and experimentation rather than just repetition of procedures. Students need opportunities to develop their own understanding of how environmental factors affect bullet flight, how different equipment responds to various conditions, and how personal shooting characteristics influence performance." A Navy commander raised a follow-up question. "But doesn't that approach require significantly more training time and individual attention than current programs can provide?" "Initially, yes," Elena acknowledged. "But soldiers who develop genuine understanding rather than just procedural knowledge tend to be more adaptable, more creative in their problem-solving, and more effective in situations that don't match their training scenarios. The investment in time and individual attention often pays dividends in improved long-term performance." The questions continued for another 20 minutes, covering topics that ranged from equipment policy to instructor training to the broader philosophy of military education. Elena found herself defending not just her specific methods, but the principle that military training could benefit from incorporating diverse approaches and unconventional knowledge sources. When the formal demonstration concluded, Elena was approached by a steady stream of officers who wanted to continue the conversations that had begun during the question period. The interest was gratifying, but it also reinforced her sense that she was now positioned at the center of debates about change and tradition that extended far beyond marksmanship training. "Sergeant Vasquez," said a voice behind her, and Elena turned to find a woman in Air Force uniform approaching with a warm smile. "Major Sarah Chen, Air Force Special Operations. I wanted to thank you for your presentation and tell you how much it resonated with my own experiences." Elena shook Major Chen's hand, noting the confidence and competence that seemed to radiate from the older officer. "Thank you, Major. May I ask about your background?" "Combat controller, 2 deployments in Afghanistan. I learned to shoot from my father, who was a competitive marksman before he became a police officer. Like you, I found that civilian training methods sometimes produced capabilities that our formal military training didn't match." Elena felt an immediate connection with Major Chen, recognizing a kindred spirit who had navigated similar challenges in adapting unconventional knowledge to military applications. "Have you been able to integrate those methods into your unit's training?" "To some extent, but it's been an uphill battle. Military institutions are naturally conservative, especially about changes that challenge established procedures." Chen paused, studying Elena's face. "But after watching your demonstration today, I'm wondering if there might be opportunities for collaboration between services, sharing methods and approaches that individual units have developed." The conversation with Major Chen continued for another 15 minutes, covering possibilities for inter-service cooperation and the challenges of implementing change in large traditional institutions. When Chen finally excused herself to catch her flight back to her home base, Elena felt energized by the prospect of finding allies and collaborators who shared her vision for expanding military marksmanship training. As the day wound down and the assembled officers began departing, Elena found herself reflecting on the distance she had traveled from that morning in Nevada when General Steele had first noticed her unconventional shooting demonstration. What had begun as a personal quest to prove her capabilities had evolved into something much larger, an opportunity to influence how the military thought about developing and utilizing exceptional talent.
General Steele approached as Elena was packing her equipment, his expression reflecting satisfaction with the day's events. "Sergeant, I think it's safe to say that your demonstration exceeded everyone's expectations." "Thank you, sir. I hope it was useful for the decision-makers who were observing." "More than useful," General Steele replied. "I've already received inquiries from 3 different commands about incorporating your training methods into their programs. There's also been discussion about developing a formal curriculum that could be implemented across multiple services." Elena felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension at the scope of possibilities that General Steele was describing. "Sir, I want to make sure I can deliver on whatever commitments are made. I'm honored by the interest, but I also want to be realistic about what one person can accomplish." "Which is why you won't be working alone," General Steele said with a smile. "Based on today's response, I expect you'll have more collaboration opportunities than you can handle. The challenge will be choosing which ones offer the greatest potential for positive impact." That evening, Elena sat in her hotel room with her grandfather's rifle across her lap, processing the day's events and their implications for her future. The demonstration had been successful beyond her wildest expectations, but it had also created responsibilities and expectations that felt overwhelming. She thought about her grandfather's stories of moments when individual actions had consequences that extended far beyond personal achievement. He'd taught her that such moments weren't accidents, but rather the natural result of preparation meeting opportunity, of years of consistent effort culminating in chances to make a difference. Elena realized that her journey was no longer just about proving her own capabilities or honoring her grandfather's memory. It had become about opening doors for others, about expanding possibilities, about demonstrating that exceptional performance could come from unexpected sources and unconventional methods. The photograph in her boot seemed to carry new weight as Elena prepared for bed. Her grandfather's eyes, captured in black and white decades earlier, seemed to hold the same quiet confidence that Elena had felt on the firing line today. But now, that confidence was tempered with understanding of the responsibilities that came with success and recognition. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight, Elena felt a deep sense of satisfaction that came not just from personal achievement, but from the knowledge that her grandfather's teachings were reaching a new generation of soldiers. The old rifle had found its voice again, speaking truths about patience, precision, and the potential that existed when tradition and innovation worked together toward common goals. 6 months after the Fort Benning demonstration, Elena found herself standing in front of a classroom at the newly established Joint Services Marksmanship Training Center, watching 24 carefully selected instructors from all branches of the military absorb the principles that had once been passed down through quiet conversations between a grandfather and his granddaughter on a New Mexico ranch. The center itself represented a remarkable transformation. What had begun as Elena's personal quest to prove her capabilities had evolved into a systematic effort to revolutionize how the military approached precision shooting instruction. The facility combined cutting-edge technology with traditional methods, featuring both computer-controlled environmental chambers for consistent training and outdoor ranges where students learned to read natural wind patterns and atmospheric conditions.
The integration of systematic and intuitive approaches, Elena explained to her students, isn't about choosing one method over another. It's about understanding that different situations require different tools, and exceptional marksmen need to be fluent in both technical precision and instinctive adaptation. In the front row, Staff Sergeant Williams, now one of Elena's most dedicated students and advocates, took careful notes while occasionally glancing at the demonstration rifle he'd be using for the afternoon's practical exercise. His transformation from skeptic to supporter had become one of the program's most powerful testimonials, demonstrating that even experienced instructors could benefit from expanding their understanding of marksmanship fundamentals. "Sergeant Vasquez," asked Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, a Marine Corps instructor who had volunteered for the program despite resistance from some in her chain of command, "how do we balance the need for standardized procedures with the individualized attention that intuitive skill development requires?" Elena smiled.
recognizing in Morrison's question the same challenges she'd faced when first trying to systematize her grandfather's teaching methods. The key is understanding that standardization and individualization aren't mutually exclusive. We can standardize the framework while allowing for individual adaptation within that framework. She moved to the whiteboard, sketching a diagram that had become central to the center's curriculum. Think of systematic training as providing the vocabulary and grammar of marksmanship, the fundamental principles that apply in all situations. Intuitive development is about learning to speak that language fluently, to adapt and improvise based on specific conditions and personal characteristics. The afternoon's practical exercise took place on the center's primary range, where targets were positioned at distances ranging from 800 to 2,200 meters across terrain that challenged both technical skill and environmental awareness. Elena had designed the course to replicate the kind of complex shooting scenarios that military marksmen might encounter in real-world operations, where perfect conditions and ideal equipment weren't guaranteed. As her students settled into their shooting positions, Elena walked among them, observing their preparation routines and offering guidance tailored to each individual's learning style and experience level. The diversity of the group, representing different services, backgrounds, and shooting philosophies, had initially created challenges, but was now proving to be one of the program's greatest strengths. "Take your time reading the wind," Elena advised Sergeant First Class Jackson, an Army Ranger whose aggressive approach to shooting sometimes caused him to rush environmental assessments. "The targets aren't going anywhere, and a patient shot is almost always better than a quick shot." At the next position, Elena worked with Major Chen, the Air Force officer who had become one of her closest collaborators in developing the inter-service curriculum. Chen's technical background had proven invaluable in documenting and systematizing methods that Elena had learned through observation and practice. "I'm seeing a shift in the wind pattern at about 1,500 meters. Looks like the thermal updraft from that rock formation is creating turbulence." Elena nodded approvingly. Chen had developed the observational skills that Elena's grandfather had considered essential, but she'd done it through systematic practice rather than years of informal mentorship. Her success proved that the center's methods could work for students who hadn't grown up with traditional shooting instruction. The day's shooting concluded with a group discussion where students shared their observations and challenges, creating a collaborative learning environment that reinforced individual instruction. Elena had learned that some of the most valuable teaching happened when students explained concepts to each other, translating technical knowledge into practical understanding through peer-to-peer communication. "The difference between today's session and my previous training," observed Captain Rodriguez, a Navy SEAL whose unit had sent him specifically to learn Elena's wind techniques, "is that I'm not just following procedures anymore. I'm actually understanding why certain adjustments work and others don't." Elena felt the familiar satisfaction that came with successful teaching, but it was now tempered with awareness of the larger implications of what they were accomplishing. Every student who graduated from the center would return to their units with expanded capabilities and teaching methods that could influence hundreds of other soldiers over the course of their careers. After the students departed, Elena walked through the facility that had become her professional home and intellectual laboratory. The center's establishment had required navigating complex inter-service politics, budget negotiations, and institutional resistance that had sometimes made Elena question whether the effort was worth the stress and controversy. But moments like today's successful training session reminded her why she'd accepted the challenges that came with being an institutional change agent. The center wasn't just about improving marksmanship training, it was about demonstrating that military effectiveness could be enhanced by incorporating diverse knowledge sources and unconventional approaches. Elena's office had become a repository for the documentation that was transforming her grandfather's informal teaching methods into systematic curriculum. The walls were covered with charts that translated observational techniques into instructional frameworks, ballistic calculations that supported intuitive wind reading methods, and photographs that showed the progression from traditional training approaches to integrated methodologies.
On her desk, beside the administrative materials that came with her new responsibilities, sat the photograph of her grandfather that had once lived in her boot. Now properly framed, it served as a daily reminder of the principles that had guided her journey from that Nevada firing range to this position of influence and responsibility. A knock at her office's door interrupted Elena's end-of-day reflection, and she looked up to see General Steele entering with a folder that suggested official business. His visits had become more frequent as the center's success had attracted attention from the highest levels of military leadership. "Sergeant Vasquez," General Steele said, his formal tone indicating that this wasn't a casual conversation, "I have some news that I think you'll find interesting." Elena gestured to the chair across from her desk, noting that General Steele's expression combined satisfaction with something that might have been anticipation. "Good news or challenging news, sir?" "Both, potentially," General Steele replied, settling into the chair and opening his folder. "The center's success has generated requests from several allied militaries for training exchanges and curriculum sharing. The British, Canadians, and Australians are particularly interested in incorporating your methods into their programs." Elena felt her pulse quicken at the international implications of what General Steele was describing. "That's significant." "It gets more significant," General Steele continued. "There's also been a request from the State Department for you to participate in a military assistance program in Eastern Europe. Several NATO allies are modernizing their military training, and they've specifically asked for instruction in advanced marksmanship techniques." The scope of the opportunity was staggering, but Elena had learned to think carefully about commitments that could expand beyond her ability to deliver effectively. "Sir, I'm honored by the interest, but I want to make sure I can maintain the quality of instruction that these requests deserve." "Which brings me to the other piece of news," General Steele said with a smile. "Your promotion to Staff Sergeant has been approved, along with authorization to expand the center's staff. You'll be able to select and train additional instructors who can help manage the growing demand for your curriculum." Elena felt a mixture of excitement and responsibility at the prospect of leading a larger team and expanding the center's impact. But she also felt a pang of concern about maintaining the personal touch that had made her grandfather's teaching so effective.
Sir, may I ask about the timeline for these developments? The staff expansion can begin immediately. The international requests are more flexible. You'd have time to train your new instructors and establish procedures before taking on additional commitments. General Steele paused, studying Elena's expression. "But I want to be clear about what accepting these opportunities would mean. You'd essentially become the military's primary expert on non-traditional marksmanship training, with all the visibility and responsibility that role entails." Elena thought about the path that had brought her to this moment, from her grandfather's patient teaching to her mother's quiet support of her military ambitions, to the challenges and opportunities that had emerged from a single exceptional shooting demonstration. Each step had prepared her for greater responsibilities and broader impact. "Sir, I accept the promotion and the opportunity to expand the center's capabilities." General Steele nodded, apparently having expected that response. "Excellent. Your first task will be identifying and recruiting instructors who can maintain the standards you've established while adapting your methods to their own teaching styles." Over the following weeks, Elena found herself immersed in the complex process of scaling successful innovation. Identifying potential instructors required assessing not just shooting capabilities, but teaching aptitude, adaptability, and commitment to the center's integrated approach to marksmanship training. The selection process attracted applications from across the military, with soldiers requesting transfer to the center based on its growing reputation for producing exceptional results. Elena reviewed service records, conducted interviews, and observed shooting demonstrations as she worked to build a team that could maintain quality while expanding capacity. Among the successful candidates was Master Sergeant Jennifer Chen,
Elena's former colleague from Nevada who had provided crucial support during Elena's early military career. Chen's combination of technical knowledge, teaching experience, and understanding of institutional dynamics made her an ideal choice for helping manage the center's growth. "I never imagined when I was giving you advice in that Nevada bathroom that you'd end up recruiting me for your own program," Chen observed as she reviewed the center's curriculum materials during her orientation week. Elena laughed, remembering those early morning conversations that had helped her navigate the challenges of military life as one of the few women in a combat-related specialty. "I never imagined I'd be in a position to recruit anyone. This whole experience has been about accepting opportunities that seemed impossible when they first appeared." Chen's integration into the center's staff proved seamless, and her presence allowed Elena to focus on the international training requests that were becoming increasingly urgent. The NATO allies who had requested assistance were facing real-world security challenges that required immediate improvement in their military capabilities. Elena's first international assignment took her to Estonia, where she worked with a small group of military instructors who were responsible for training their nation's limited but highly motivated defense forces. The cultural and linguistic differences created challenges, but Elena found that the universal principles of marksmanship transcended such barriers. "The relationship between shooter and rifle," Elena explained through a translator to a group of Estonian officers, "is the same whether you learn to shoot in New Mexico or in Tallinn. The equipment may be different, the language may be different, but the fundamental requirements of patience, precision, and understanding remain constant." The Estonian experience proved both rewarding and educational for Elena. Working with soldiers who were defending their homeland against potential aggression reminded her of the ultimate purpose behind military training, not just achieving high scores on ranges, but preparing for situations where lives and freedom might depend on shooting capability. When Elena returned to the United States after 2 weeks in Estonia, she found the center buzzing with activity as new instructors completed their training and additional students arrived
for advanced courses. The facility that had begun as an experimental program was rapidly becoming an established institution with influence extending far beyond its original scope. The success brought new challenges, including political attention that wasn't always welcome. Elena found herself testifying before congressional committees about military training budgets, answering questions from journalists about women in combat roles, and managing expectations from senior leaders who sometimes had unrealistic timelines for implementing change. The hardest part, Elena confided to Major Chen during one of their evening debriefing sessions, isn't the technical aspects of what we're doing. It's managing all the non-technical factors that come with success, the politics, the publicity, the pressure to expand faster than we can maintain quality. Chen nodded sympathetically, having observed Elena's struggle to balance institutional demands with the personal standards that had driven her success. Maybe that's where your grandfather's teaching is most valuable. Not just the shooting techniques, but the patience and persistence that made those techniques possible. The observation resonated deeply with Elena, reminding her that her grandfather's most important lessons had been about character and commitment rather than just technical skill. As the center continued to grow and evolve, those foundational principles would become increasingly important for maintaining the integrity that had made their work successful. 1 year after the center's establishment, Elena stood before an audience of senior military leaders at the Pentagon, presenting the annual report that documented their achievements and outlined plans for continued expansion. The statistics were impressive. Graduation rates that exceeded those of traditional programs, performance improvements that had been validated through independent testing, and requests for training that far exceeded their current capacity. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real measure of their success was visible in the transformed capabilities of soldiers who had returned to their units with expanded skills and new approaches to training others. Elena had received reports from combat units around the world describing improved performance that could be traced directly to instruction received at the center.
The integration of traditional and innovative training methods has demonstrated that military effectiveness can be enhanced without compromising the standards and traditions that have served us well. Our graduates are not just better shooters, they're better teachers, more adaptable problem solvers, and more effective leaders. The presentation was well received, but Elena knew that sustained success would require continued innovation and adaptation. The military landscape was constantly evolving, and the center's methods would need to evolve as well to remain relevant and effective. After the Pentagon presentation, Elena returned to the center to find a package waiting on her desk. Inside was a letter from Williams, who had recently been promoted and transferred to a new assignment, along with a photograph that showed him working with a group of young soldiers on a training range. "Dear Staff Sergeant Vasquez," the letter began, "I wanted you to see the result of what you taught me. These soldiers are learning marksmanship the way you learned it from your grandfather, not just technical procedures, but principles that will serve them throughout their careers. Thank you for showing me that being a good instructor means being willing to learn from anyone who has something valuable to teach." Elena studied the photograph, noting the patient attention that Williams was giving to each student and the careful way he was demonstrating the observation techniques that Elena had taught him. The image captured something essential about the center's mission, not just improving individual capabilities, but creating a generation of instructors who could pass on both technical knowledge and the deeper understanding that came with principled practice.
"Jesus Christ," muttered Lieutenant Colonel Brooks, no longer bothering to hide his amazement. "She's not even using a spotter. How is she compensating for wind drift at those distances?" Private Johnson had given up trying to follow the action through his binoculars and was simply listening to the rhythm of Elena's shooting. Shot 10 came 4 minutes after shot 9, and he realized she was taking her time now, probably adjusting for changing wind conditions as the morning progressed. The desert was notorious for its shifting air currents, thermal updrafts that could push a bullet several feet off target at extreme range. Elena was indeed adjusting, not just for wind, but for the subtle changes in light and temperature that affected her scope's performance. She'd been shooting with this rifle for so long that she knew its quirks better than her own reflection. The way it pulled slightly left when it got hot, the microscopic difference in point of impact between her hand-loaded 175-grain Sierra Match Kings and the military-issue ammunition. The fact that her grandfather had bedded the action himself 40 years ago, creating a level of consistency that mass-produced rifles could rarely match. Shot 11 was the second furthest target, a steel silhouette that wavered like a mirage in the strengthening heat. Elena held her breath, felt her heartbeat slow to that steady rhythm that meant everything was aligned. Body, mind, rifle, and target existing in perfect harmony for the fraction of a second it took the bullet to travel nearly 3 kilometers. The hit was so clean, so perfectly centered, that the steel target rang like a bell. The sound carried across the desert with unusual clarity, and Elena knew that everyone within 5 miles had heard it. She was running out of targets, but more importantly, she was running out of ammunition. Her grandfather's rifle held 5 rounds, and she'd brought only 3 boxes of her carefully prepared handloads. Each cartridge represented hours of precise work, weighing powder charges to the 10th of a grain, seeding bullets to exact specifications, ensuring that every variable she could control was perfect. "Shot 11, she whispered to the rifle, as if it could understand. Target 12 was the furthest, a small metal square at 2,847 meters, according to her range card. At that distance, the bullet would take nearly 4 seconds to reach its target, plenty of time for wind, temperature, and a dozen other factors to push it off course. But Elena had been preparing for this shot her entire life, through countless hours of practice, through her grandfather's stories, through the quiet confidence that came from knowing she belonged here, on this ridge, with this rifle, taking this shot. She exhaled slowly, let her natural point of aim settle, and felt the trigger break with the crispness of a glass rod snapping. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and Elena watched through her scope as the bullet traced its long arc through the desert air. 4 seconds felt like 4 hours, but then the distant target disappeared in a shower of fragments, and the sound of the impact rolled back across the training ground like distant thunder. General Steele slowly lowered his binoculars, his mind struggling to process what he'd just witnessed. 12 targets, 12 hits, distances that pushed the envelope of what was considered possible for military snipers with the most advanced equipment available. And Elena Vasquez had done it with a rifle that belonged in a museum, from a position that wasn't even part of the official course, without a spotter or any of the support equipment that modern precision shooting required. "Sergeant Major." General Steele's voice was carefully controlled, betraying none of the amazement he felt. "I want Sergeant Vasquez in my office at 0800 tomorrow morning." Patterson nodded, but his eyes were still fixed on the distant hillside where Elena was finally rising from her shooting position, her grandfather's rifle cradled in her arms like a sacred artifact. "Yes, sir. Should I tell her what this is about?"
Briefing. On my way, Elena responded, taking one last look at her grandfather's marker before beginning the walk back to the facility that had become her life's work. The Joint Services Marksmanship Training Center had expanded far beyond its original scope, now occupying a complex of buildings that housed not just training facilities, but also research laboratories, equipment development workshops, and conference centers where military leaders from around the world came to study the integration of traditional and modern shooting techniques. Elena entered the main briefing room to find representatives from 6 different nations waiting for her presentation on cultural adaptation of marksmanship training methods. The audience included officers from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, and Ukraine, countries whose recent history had given them urgent reasons to develop military capabilities that could deter aggression and defend sovereignty. "Good morning," Elena began, her voice carrying the confidence that came from 7 years of international teaching experience. "Today we'll explore how the fundamental principles of precision shooting can be adapted to different cultural contexts, equipment limitations, and operational requirements." She clicked to her first slide, which showed a photograph of her grandfather's rifle alongside images of modern military sniper systems from various countries. Effective marksmanship training begins with understanding that excellence comes not from having perfect equipment, but from developing perfect understanding of whatever equipment you have available. The presentation that followed drew on case studies from Elena's work in dozens of countries, each facing unique challenges that required adapting universal shooting principles to specific circumstances. In some cases, budget constraints meant working with older equipment that required creative solutions. In others, cultural differences about women in military roles had required careful navigation of social sensitivities while maintaining training effectiveness. The Estonian experience, Elena explained, showing photographs from her multiple training deployments to that country, demonstrated that small military forces can achieve disproportionate defensive capabilities when individual soldiers are trained to exceptional standards. Quality can often compensate for quantity when training is sufficiently comprehensive. Captain Ryan Tom, the Estonian delegation leader who had become a close friend and collaborator during Elena's multiple visits to his country, raised his hand to ask a question. "Sergeant Major, how do we maintain training quality when expanding programs to meet increased demand for qualified marksmen?" Elena nodded, recognizing a challenge that every successful training program faced. "The key is developing instructors who understand principles rather than just procedures. When teachers truly comprehend why certain techniques work, they can adapt those techniques to new situations and help students develop their own understanding rather than just memorizing steps." The question-and-answer session continued for another hour, covering topics that ranged from equipment procurement to instructor certification to the political challenges of implementing military reforms. Elena found herself drawing not just on technical knowledge, but on the diplomatic skills she'd developed through years of working with diverse international partners. After the delegation departed for their tour of the training facilities, Elena retreated to her office to review the afternoon's schedule. The calendar was packed with meetings that reflected the center's expanded role: budget discussions with Pentagon officials, curriculum planning with her senior staff, and a video conference with military leaders in the Pacific who were requesting training support for their own regional security challenges.
The office itself had evolved to reflect Elena's growing responsibilities and international focus. The walls now displayed flags from the 43 countries whose military personnel had trained at the center, along with photographs that documented the program's global impact. Behind her desk hung a large map of the world, with pins marking every location where graduates had served, creating a visual representation of the center's expanding influence. But the most prominent feature remained the simple wooden display case that held her grandfather's rifle, positioned where Elena could see it during every meeting and phone call. The weapon served as both inspiration and reminder. Inspiration for the possibilities that could emerge from patient teaching and dedicated practice, and reminder of the principles that should guide every decision about the center's future. A knock at her door interrupted Elena's schedule review, and she looked up to see Master Sergeant Chen entering with a folder that bore the distinctive markings of classified material. Chen's role had expanded along with the center's mission, and she now served as Elena's deputy for international operations. "Chen," Elena said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk, "please tell me that folder contains something interesting, rather than just more administrative requirements." Chen smiled as she settled into the chair, her expression suggesting that the folder indeed contained something significant. "Remember the conversation we had 3 years ago about scaling successful innovation? I think you're going to find this request particularly meaningful." Elena accepted the folder and opened it to find a proposal from the Mexican military for a comprehensive training exchange program. The request was detailed and thoughtful, describing how Mexico's armed forces wanted to modernize their marksmanship training while preserving traditional methods that had proven effective in their unique operational environment. "They specifically mentioned your grandfather's heritage," Chen explained, as Elena read through the proposal. "Apparently, word of his influence on your teaching methods has reached officers who remember serving with Mexican-American soldiers during joint operations. They're hoping to explore whether traditional Mexican shooting techniques might complement the integrated approach you've developed." Elena felt an unexpected emotional response to the proposal, recognizing an opportunity to honor her grandfather's cultural heritage while expanding the center's impact in a region where effective military training had urgent practical applications. Mexico's security challenges required soldiers capable of operating in diverse terrain against well-equipped adversaries, making precision marksmanship skills essential for mission success. "What's the timeline for their request?" Elena asked. "They're hoping to begin the exchange program within 6 months, starting with a delegation of their instructors coming here for familiarization with our methods, followed by our team providing on-site training at their facilities." Elena studied the proposal more carefully, noting the thoughtful way it addressed both technical requirements and cultural sensitivities. The Mexican military had clearly done their research, proposing a collaborative approach that emphasized mutual learning rather than one-sided instruction. "Set up a preliminary meeting," Elena decided. "I want to explore how we can develop this partnership in ways that honor both our traditions and their needs." The afternoon's video conference connected Elena with military leaders in Japan, Australia, and the Philippines, countries that were facing their own regional security challenges and looking for training methods that could enhance their defensive capabilities. The conversation covered familiar topics:
equipment selection, instructor development, and adaptation of training
methods to specific operational requirements, but also addressed emerging challenges related to technological integration and evolving threat environments. The question we're grappling with, explained Colonel Tanaka from the Japanese Self-Defense Forces, is how to maintain the human skills that remain essential even as technology becomes more sophisticated. We don't want our soldiers to become dependent on equipment that might not be available in all situations. Elena nodded, understanding the balance that modern military forces had to strike between embracing technological advantages and maintaining fundamental capabilities. That's exactly why we emphasize principles over procedures. Technology should enhance human capability, not replace it. Soldiers who understand fundamental shooting principles can adapt to any equipment.